We have some familiar faces and some new faces who will bolster depth for the Jets. Let's talk the latest Jets roster moves today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, August 29th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, on the day after Cutdown Day, the Jets made a number of roster moves. They made a waiver wire claim. They lost a player to the waiver wire, and they signed their practice squad. A very eventful day after Cutdown Day. That's why one of the reasons we always say Cutdown Day is just the beginning. And as I mentioned yesterday, that initial 53-man Jets roster was unlikely to be the roster they took into the Week 1 game against San Francisco, and we already have our first change. The Jets put in a waiver claim, and they acquired tight end Brenden Bates off waivers from the Chicago Bears. Bates was an undrafted rookie out of Kentucky, and if you're not familiar with how the waiver process works, when players are cut at the end of training camp, if they have less than 4 years of experience, the 31 other teams all have a chance to claim the player. And if you claim the player, you get him. And you take his you get the same contract he had with the old team. If more than one team claims a player, then he goes to whatever team claimed him that had the highest draft pick in the first round of the NFL draft in the spring. And we talked about this yesterday, and I mentioned it that, you know what, the Jets were not going to carry two tight ends into that game against San Francisco Week 1. That was a guarantee because in the initial 53-man roster, they only had Tyler Conklin and Jeremy Ruckert. And Kenny Yeboah was on injured reserve, which means, Yeboah probably will be back at some point this year, but he won't be ready for Week 1. And if you want to run jumbo packages, you want to run, on the goal line with 3 tight ends, but you got to have a third tight end. If somebody gets hurt, then you can't run 2 tight end sets if you only keep 2 tight ends on your roster. So the Jets had to add a third tight end. And as I mentioned yesterday, it felt like that initial roster was kind of, it was kind of like a placeholder where they had their eye on somebody who was going to be waived. And as it turns out, it's Brenden Bates, the tight end for the Chicago Bears, who was just waived, who, had a good preseason. I mean, to the extent it matters, and I don't know how much it really matters, but because we've seen in the past how, how meaningless preseason stats are when we talk about projecting players once the regular season begins. But Brenden Bates finished third on the Bears in receptions and second in receiving yards in the preseason. More than that, there are tools to potentially work with. I mean, he's big. He's 6'5", 255 pounds. So, it's pretty big for a tight end, potential blocker. By all accounts, he blocked pretty well in the preseason. Again, he was productive receiving in the preseason. And the other aspect of this is his athletic testing is all across the board. It was average to above average. So a guy who conceivably has the tools to be a decent player. Now, of course, he's going to start as the third tight end. Tyler Conklin is going to be the number 1 tight end for the Jets. Jeremy Ruckert is going to be the number 2 tight end. So your number 3 tight end, he's a guy who really is only going to see the field in jumbo sets. And if somebody gets injured, he's insurance in case somebody gets injured. So you can run multi-tight end sets. I mean, that's really what Bates' role will be on this roster. And as with any, young developmental player, they'll try and develop him. And I'm not sure his spot on this roster is guaranteed any further than Kenny Yeboah's return, because I think, the Jets like to use Kenny Yeboah on special teams. I think when we're talking about a third tight end, again, third tight end's not going to see the field that much in conventional offensive situations, but a third tight end can see the field quite a bit at special teams. But Bates also may get a shot to take some of those Yeboah snaps on special teams. And if he succeeds playing under Brant Boyer in the game's third phase, maybe he's got an opportunity to stick. Expectations should always be low for any waiver wire pickup. Undrafted free agent. But, there are guys who you look at and there's no pathway for them to be a good player. If you look at Bates' physical tools, if you look at what he did in the preseason, look, it's unlikely. He'll probably max out as a number 3 tight end. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, the odds are particularly great that he's going to amount to anything. But there's at least a pathway. There's at least, you can at least see if things go right with his development, if he gets the right coaching, a little bit of luck, if he takes to certain concepts, you could see him potentially being a tight end in this league. And when we're talking about waiver wire claims, we're talking about guys who did not make the 53-man roster of the team they were in training camp with. So, the criteria is pretty low. And that's pretty much the criteria I have. If Brenden Bates can be anything productive, it'll be a win for the Jets. But that's not the expectation. I mean, more than anything, he's just, at this point, he's kind of a body the Jets can have around so that they have a number 3 tight end. They do need to make a corresponding move, which they have not made at the point we are recording this podcast. The Jets will have to cut or waive somebody in order to make a spot on the 53-man roster for Bates. That has yet to happen. I would imagine it's going to be, somebody from one of the 3 position groups I talked about yesterday where the Jets are carrying excess. That's running back, Izzy Abanikanda, offensive line, Max Mitchell would be the most obvious candidate to cut, or wide receiver where Jason Brownlee would be the most obvious candidate to cut. So we'll see where the Jets go. They may end up going somewhere else. I mean, it's not a guarantee they'll go to one of those spots, but the Jets do add tight end Brenden Bates. The Jets also did lose a player off waivers, Shamar Bartholomew. He was a corner. The Carolina Panthers claimed him, one of 6 claims the Panthers made. So, as I mentioned, the team that had the highest pick in the NFL draft has the top priority order in waivers. And I know Carolina actually traded their pick, but they go with your original pick. So Carolina actually has priority over everybody else. They made 6 waiver claims, which if you're at the bottom of the league, odds are players cut on, Carolina is coming off the season where they were the worst team in the league. So odds are players cut by other teams are better than Carolina's 53rd best player. Again, Carolina claimed 6 players. One of them came from the Jets. Again, it was a corner, Shamar Bartholomew. Probably not a name you're familiar with, even if you're a diehard Jets fan. I actually thought Bartholomew played pretty well in the preseason, but there was just no path for a corner to make the roster on this team. I mean, it's a positive thing for the Jets because they just have so much good stuff at corner that there was no free spot available, even though I thought Bartholomew played pretty well. I would imagine the Panthers pro scouting department caught on to Bartholomew. And of course, the Jets played the Panthers, so maybe Bartholomew made an impression when these 2 teams played in the preseason week 2. And again, I did think he played pretty well, but with the Jets, there was just no free spot for a corner because you've got the top trio in the league and Sauce and DJ and Carter. Behind him, you have Brandon Echols, who, not the most beloved player in the fan base, but a guy with starting experience, a guy who can play inside and outside, a guy the coaching staff likes. And then after that, you'll have 2 draft picks who are showing promise, Jarek Bernard-Converse and Quantez Stiggers. So if you're looking for the young guy with upside, well, you drafted 2 guys who looked really good in the preseason. And tough to keep 7 corners. I think the Jets maybe they were trying to get Bartholomew onto the practice squad, but it's tough. And at some level, it shows you the talent at the corner position. I mean, there are years where Shamar Bartholomew probably could have parlayed his preseason performance into a roster spot, but this year the Jets have a lot of talent at the corner position. You have to let good guys go. I think you wish Bartholomew the best. He's not in the AFC East. He's not in the AFC. I think it's easy to root for him, have success elsewhere, and a team where maybe he's got an opportunity. It's tough. It's tough to be a corner on the Jets right now because they're so loaded with talent at the position. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about some other players who did not make the 53-man roster, but guys who are staying with the Jets because they're remaining on the practice squad. There's also one pretty big name player who did not spend training camp with the Jets who's joining the practice squad. And it has the fan base excited. We'll talk about who that is and how excited the fan base should be continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime now has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. It makes an already awesome app even easier because Gametime, one of my go-to apps. Whenever I'm an hour or 2 before an event I want to go to, I pull out the Gametime app, open it on my phone. And the deals you get are unbelievable. The best part about Gametime is you get the view from your seat. They show you a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat. So there's no surprises, no obstructed views, no holes in your way blocking the field. Gametime is the place to go to get in on the action, and you can get your ticket like an hour or 2 before your event starts. It's just absolutely amazing. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Tomorrow, we are going to try and have our weekly mailbag. Usually we have it on Wednesday, but with all the roster news this week, we're kind of bumping it to late in the week. So please send in your questions. As we talked about, yesterday was a busy day. It usually is. The day after Cutdown Day is a day with a lot of moves in the NFL because you have to remember on Cutdown Day, over 1,200 players are released or waived. So that means, most teams in the league, they have a player or two they have their eye on. And so you see a lot of movement, a lot of player movement, a lot of signings, a lot of waiver claims across the league. But teams also can start filling out their practice squads. Teams can have 16 to 17 players on their practice squad, depending on whether or not their team participates in what's known as the International Pathway Program. Normally you get 16 players. If you take on an international player and try and develop him, the NFL allows you to have a 17th spot. And the Jets started signing their practice squad. And believe it or not, the biggest name from the Jets practice squad signings was not a guy who spent training camp with the Jets. It's actually a former first-round pick from 2 years ago, Lewis Cine, a safety who played with the Minnesota Vikings, who was let go by the Vikings this past preseason. And this move has the fan base excited. I think whenever you bring in a former first-round pick and you can sneak him onto the practice squad, people start dreaming. The cliche whenever one of these guys is signed, well, he must have talent if he got picked in the first round. If we can just figure out a way to hone this talent, we'll be in good shape. And look, the practice squad is there to try and develop players. Practice squad exists for a couple reasons. First of all, it's kind of a reserve system for your team. If you have an injury, you need a replacement player. If a safety goes down, the Jets can call Cine up off the practice squad and he can play for them. It's not exactly like a minor league, but in some ways it kind of functions like it. It's kind of like your AAA system, even though in many ways it's different from a conventional minor league. Your practice squad also works on the scout team, and each week you're preparing for a given opponent. And you don't want like your starting offense to emulate that week's opponent to get your defense prepared. So frequently what happens is the practice squad, the guys on the practice squad essentially function as the scout team. And so you'll get a wide receiver who tries to mimic the way a receiver runs routes for that week's opponent. Tries to mimic those tendencies so that your defensive players get used to facing that opponent. But it's also a spot where you're trying to develop talents. You're dealing with guys who were not necessarily highly rated players, and guys who maybe need some work on their game, guys who maybe need a little bit of refinement as they try and hone their craft. And of course, the Jets are going to try and develop Lewis Cine into a good player. I think whenever you're bringing guys in to the practice squad, it's because on some level you've evaluated that they have a chance to succeed in this league. But I do think it's important to keep expectations in check with a player like this, in part because part of the reason Cine was let go by the Vikings, I think, is it doesn't seem like he's ever recovered from a serious injury he suffered as a rookie. He suffered a compound fracture his rookie season. And the one thing I'll tell you is that teams like to look smart, and teams do not like admitting mistakes in this league. And that's pronounced in many areas, but maybe none more so than in the way teams hold on to their first round picks. Because if you cut a first round pick, it's an admission you failed. It's an admission you went wrong somewhere along the line. Now, again, Cine suffered an injury, so maybe there's a little bit of a caveat to this. But when a team cuts a first-round pick after 2 years, a first-round pick is a huge investment in a player. To cut your losses after 2 years is not something that's commonly done in this league. So the fact the Vikings were able to let Cine go, that's probably a sign that this is going to be a tough hill to climb for him. It's not going to be impossible, but if Minnesota had any reason to hold on to him at all, they probably would have done it because they just have so much invested in him. It's in every team's interest to try and make it work with a first round pick, to do everything in their power. And typically only after a team has concluded there's no chance this player is going to succeed with us, that's really the only point where you move on. Now, that's not to say it's impossible for a first round pick to be cut and then go on to a new team and have success. It has been known to happen in this league, but I think it's worth noting that the Vikings were willing to move on after 2 years. And was that due to injury? Well, if it was, then that's a sign that the doctors who evaluated Cine maybe have concluded that he's not going to get back to the level he needs to be at to be a successful player in this league. So I think it's important to remember this is a practice squad player. This is a guy who was a first round pick 2 years ago who did not find an active roster spot in this league. And again, none of this is to say it's impossible for Lewis Cine to turn it around. There are some miraculous recoveries in this league. There are guys who are written off injury-wise, who figure out a way to put it together, who figure out a way to get healthy, who maybe get a little bit of luck with their injuries and turn it around. But I think that it's important to keep your expectations in check. Cine is not a player who's likely to play a very big role for the Jets this year. And it's frankly, when you're talking about a guy who was a first-round pick who's now on a practice squad, the odds are against him. So, I think I think some of the expectations that are being put on him are a bit unfair. I think it would be great if he could turn it around. I think it would be great if he could make a career for himself. It would be an amazing story, especially since it seems like his career was derailed in part because of an injury. You always like to see it when a guy can bounce back from that. But it is going to be a tough road back for him. And I think we need to be clear-eyed about that. I think that we should set expectations low. I mean, look, he's not one of the top 4 safeties on this team right now. So he's not a guy the Jets are going to count on. I don't think he's going to be active for many games if their top safeties are healthy. We know the top safeties on the team are Tony Adams, Chuck Clark, then Ashton Davis, then Isaiah Oliver. Cine is at least below him, at least below all those guys on the depth chart. Look, this defensive coaching staff, they've done a very good job with players. They've done a good job putting players in the right position to succeed. Could the Jets potentially find a role for Cine? Maybe he's not a full-time starter. Could he turn into a good role player? Potentially, there are guys who they've been able to figure out how to do that with, including Ashton Davis. But so all this is to not write Cine off. It's just to make people understand that this is not like some slam dunk move that the Jets managed to get some star safety on their practice squad. It's going to be a tough road. It's going to be a long process. Now, head to the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll continue talking about the Jets practice squad because there are some more familiar faces. We didn't have Lewis Cine in training camp, but most of the players that Jets signed to their practice squad are on the team, and it kind of reveals one of their plans about the way they built this roster. And we'll go into more detail on that continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. You've heard me talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, now I have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch regular season games Sunday afternoons that are televised out of market. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment that you can cancel anytime. And look, if you're an NFL fan, Sunday Ticket's a must. It's not on DirecTV anymore. You can just stream it to your house through YouTube and YouTube TV. If you're a Jets fan out of market, you're going to need to see some Jets games. If you're a Jets fan in New York, lots of Jets primetime games this year. Sunday afternoons are going to be free. Do you really want to have to depend on what Fox and CBS locally are showing, or do you want to watch the games you want to watch? And to make it even sweeter, you can bet $5 and win on FanDuel. So how about that? Free NFL Sunday Ticket for 3 weeks, and you win some money on FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're talking about Jets roster moves yesterday. Jets made a waiver claim. They lost a player to waivers, and they signed to their practice squad. Now, biggest name player the Jets added to their practice squad was Lewis Cine, a former first-round pick by the Minnesota Vikings. We just talked about him. There are a lot of other familiar faces, though, who were signed to the practice squad. And, on yesterday's show, I mentioned I was, a little surprised about a couple of the players the Jets cut. And among them were Anthony Ferkser, who's a tight end / fullback. Another guy, Sam McGuavin, who was nominally a linebacker, but a special teamer. They both signed to the Jets practice squad. And I thought both of them would be on the team. And the fact they're on the practice squad got me thinking a little bit. And I remember the Jets kept 3 undrafted rookies. And veterans like McGuavin and Ferkser, they are not subject to the waiver claim, the waiver process. So you're placed on waivers so you have less than 4 years of experience. For veterans who have been around the league more than 4 years, you just become a free agent. You can sign with anybody. You're not exposed. No team can claim you. You just sign wherever you want. And I wonder, maybe the Jets had a little deal in place with these guys. Maybe the Jets were a little worried about losing the undrafted guys to waivers if they cut them. So they went to these veterans and said, why don't we have a deal? We sign you to our practice squad. Maybe we'll elevate you for a couple games. Maybe our Jets are playing the game a little bit in order to make sure they keep their promising rookies, and they're keeping, but they also keep the veterans that they want around. good stuff by the. If so, I like the move. I think that's pretty savvy stuff by the Jets. I mean, I think sometimes we overrate the likelihood that our undrafted rookies are going to be claimed by other teams. But if you have to risk it, don't risk it. So I thought that was. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but pretty savvy stuff by the Jets if that's how it went down. And some other familiar names on the practice squad list. So Adrian Martinez beat out Andrew Peasley for the temporary number 3 quarterback job. We know that once Jordan Travis is healthy, he will be the number 3 quarterback. But the Jets signed Martinez to their practice squad, so for the time being, he'll be the number 3 quarterback. Now he will not be active on game days, unless the Jets elevate him. But and the number 3 quarterback cannot be the emergency quarterback. He has to be one of the if you elevate a quarterback from the practice squad, he has to be one of the active players. He can't be the emergency quarterback who doesn't count against your active players, if you're familiar with that. But Martinez stays as the number 3 quarterback. I kind of agree with that. I think Martinez showed a little bit more than Peasley. I mean, look, neither of them looks that great. Neither of them really looks like they're going to have much of a future in the NFL. But if it came down to it, with Martinez in the game over Peasley, you can at least build in some quarterback run plays for Martinez because he's pretty mobile. So you can design some quarterback runs and try to keep your offense afloat that way. Mr. Irrelevant makes the practice squad. Jalen Key, the safety that the Jets drafted with the final selection in 2024. He makes the team as a safety. So that he might be in battle with Lewis Cine for who's the top safety off the practice squad. Jets also brought back Zach Kuntz, who's an uber athletic tight end. Really did not flash much in the preseason. In fact, if anything, flashed negatively because ball or two went through his hands that should not have. Kuntz is the classic guy who's a great athlete who they're trying to turn into a football player. There was really no justification for keeping him on the roster. Another year on the practice squad, give him one more year on the practice squad to see if he can amount to something, to see if he can make good on those physical tools. Nothing wrong with that. Brenden Smith, the wide receiver who flashed in the preseason, makes the practice squad. For how little depth the Jets have at wide receiver, I would not have minded to see Smith make the team. Smith was part of some big plays in the preseason. I don't know how good he'd be if he ever was called upon in real games, but I thought he flashed enough. He showed enough playmaking ability. I wouldn't have minded seeing him on the regular roster, but the Jets are able to get into the practice squad, which, is not a bad thing. Again, practice squads for a lot of these guys is about development. It's for guys who flash some ability, but you're looking to see them put it together more consistently. So Brenden Smith also on the practice squad. So Jets ended up with signing 17 players. We don't need to go through the whole list. Those are the big names. Some veterans who are familiar, who maybe the Jets came to kind of a handshake deal with before training camp, a number 3 quarterback, and then a couple of promising guys who play different positions. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast for us, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week. And please send in your mailbag questions.